And sitting at the bottom of every target list that any serious American war planner has ever developed, present in every version of every planning document, regardless of the scope of the operation being contemplated, is Iranian nuclear infrastructure. It has been the underlying motivation for the American-Iranian strategic confrontation for 2 decades. It is the reason the confrontation carries a weight that no other regional military standoff quite replicates. And its presence on the target list introduces a dimension of Iranian response calculus that goes well beyond the conventional military exchange being described here. What any American retaliation order of this scale does not inherently contain, and this is the operationally significant gap that most public discussion glosses over entirely, is a defined end state. The order specifies what American forces are authorized to destroy. It does not specify what outcome those strikes are intended to produce, what condition Iran must reach before the campaign is considered complete, or what Iranian response to American strikes would be deemed acceptable versus what would trigger further escalation. That ambiguity is not necessarily an oversight in the planning process. It reflects something more uncomfortable than poor staff work. It reflects the genuine strategic difficulty of defining achievable, honest objectives in a military confrontation with Iran. A difficulty that serious analysts have acknowledged privately for years, while public discourse has continued to treat American military action as a problem with a clean solution waiting at the end of it. Destroying Iranian military infrastructure does not eliminate Iranian military capability, because Iranian military capability has been deliberately designed to survive exactly the kind of campaign American forces would execute. It is distributed across a geography that resists comprehensive targeting. It is hardened against the munitions that strike aircraft carry. And it exists in significant proportion inside underground facilities built specifically to absorb the punishment of a sustained American air campaign and continue functioning. Destroying Iranian nuclear infrastructure may set the program back by years, and the strategic value of those years is not nothing. But it does not eliminate the scientific knowledge, the trained personnel, the institutional memory, or the foundational commitment of the Iranian state to the program that drives it. Programs survive strikes. Knowledge does not have a physical address. And any American strike campaign that destroys Iranian facilities and kills Iranian military personnel at the scale being described will produce an Iranian response. The nature of that response, its scale, its targeting, its duration, and its willingness to impose costs on parties beyond the United States will be determined entirely by Tehran's own escalation calculus, operating under pressures and domestic political constraints that Washington cannot fully model and cannot control. This brings us to the dimension of this confrontation that most coverage consistently refuses to address with the directness the subject demands. It is not the military exchange itself that represents the most dangerous consequence of a US-Iran war. It is what that exchange unlocks. Every serious American military option in a conflict with Iran carries within it the risk of triggering economic consequences that dwarf the original military provocation in their scale, their speed, and their effective irreversibility once set in motion. The variable that makes this true, the single geographic and economic fact that transforms a serious bilateral military confrontation into a potential civilizational economic event, is the Strait of Hormuz. 21 million barrels of oil pass through those 21 miles of water every single day. Approximately 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas transits the same choke point. The economies of Japan, South Korea, China, India, and every major European nation are threaded through the continued, uninterrupted flow of energy through a strait that sits between the Iranian coastline and the Omani Peninsula. These are not countries with the luxury of absorbing a prolonged disruption gradually. Their industrial systems, their power grids, their transportation networks, and in several cases, their basic food supply chains depend on energy inputs that move through the Strait of Hormuz on a schedule measured in days, not weeks. When that flow is interrupted, not reduced, not threatened with interruption, but physically stopped by the kind of sustained mining, missile, and naval interdiction campaign that Iran has both the capability and the documented operational intent to execute in response to American military action, the global economic consequences do not build slowly. They begin within 72 hours, and they accelerate to levels that no government economic model currently in use has been honestly designed to prepare for. Iran's ability to interdict Strait of Hormuz traffic is not a theoretical capability held in reserve for hypothetical future contingencies. It is an operational reality, documented across years of Iranian military exercises, procurement decisions, facility construction, and public statements from Iranian military leadership that Western analysts have sometimes been too quick to dismiss as bluster. The Iranian naval and aerospace assets positioned along the Makran coast and on the islands within the strait itself, including Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tums, together with a network of hardened coastal missile batteries, fast attack craft facilities, and submarine pens built with strait interdiction as their explicit operational purpose, constitute a layered anti-access capability whose suppression would require a sustained American military campaign of considerable scope and duration. That campaign would itself generate additional escalation pressure at precisely the moment when every party to the conflict is already operating under maximum stress. And underneath all of that, creating a condition that no amount of naval presence can quickly reverse, Iran can lay mines. Mines can be placed in the shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz faster by orders of magnitude than they can be swept. A minefield does not require Iranian forces to remain in the area to continue denying access. It simply exists, and the world waits, and the oil stops moving, and the clock starts running on consequences that were set in motion the moment the first American strike package crossed into Iranian airspace. Coastal missile batteries can be destroyed, but the Iranian military has spent years pre-positioning replacement systems in hardened inland facilities, specifically so that forward batteries can be reconstituted faster than American strike planners can cycle back to re-engage them. Fast attack craft can be sunk, but Iran operates from a network of hardened coastal shelters distributed along hundreds of miles of coastline, and replacements can be launched into the strait before the smoke from the previous engagement has cleared. This is not improvisation. It is a prepared, rehearsed, and deliberately redundant operational architecture built around a single strategic insight that Iranian planners have internalized more thoroughly than their American counterparts have been comfortable acknowledging. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's most powerful strategic weapon, not because Iran can win a conventional military confrontation with the United States, but because Iran does not need to win that confrontation to impose consequences on the global economy that no American military victory can undo. Any American military action that genuinely threatens the survival of the Iranian regime will trigger the use of that weapon. My research into Iranian strategic behavior across multiple confrontations and multiple decades of documented military posturing leads me to that conclusion with a degree of confidence I do not offer lightly. The oil price mathematics of a Hormuz closure are both straightforward in their logic and deeply alarming in their scale. At current global demand levels, a one-week interruption of Hormuz transit could produce oil price increases that analyst models, including those published by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and the Congressional Research Service, suggest could reach somewhere between $200 and $300 per barrel from a baseline in the $80 to $90 range. That is not a projection designed to generate alarm for its own sake. It reflects the basic supply and demand arithmetic of removing 21 million barrels per day from a global market that has no alternative source capable of compensating for that volume on short notice, combined with the speculative premium that energy markets historically attach to supply disruptions whose duration cannot be reliably estimated. A sustained closure of 2 weeks or more moves beyond price shock into something categorically different. Asian importing economies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and others, whose industrial systems are structurally dependent on Gulf energy, would face supply shortages that cannot be compensated for through strategic petroleum reserve releases at any scale those reserves are actually capable of providing. The reserves exist to manage disruptions measured in days. A sustained Hormuz closure is measured in weeks, and no reserve architecture currently in existence bridges that gap. The consequences of that supply failure would radiate outward through the global economy along every channel that energy prices touch, which is to say, every channel that exists. The inflationary impact would be immediate and severe. The recessionary pressure would follow within weeks as industrial production costs rose beyond the tolerance of supply chains already operating on margins compressed by years of just-in-time logistics optimization. The social stability consequences in developing nations, the countries that have the least capacity to absorb energy cost increases and the least institutional resilience to manage the political pressures that follow from them, would in many cases be existential in the most literal governmental sense. Leaders would fall, institutions already under stress would fracture, and the global food security architecture, which depends on affordable energy for fertilizer production, for agricultural mechanization, and for the supply chain logistics that move food from where it is grown to where it is needed, would be compromised in ways that the historical analogies from the 1973 and 1979 oil crises only partially illuminate. Those crises were severe, but the global economy's structural exposure to Gulf energy is meaningfully larger today than it was in either of those episodes. The alternative supply infrastructure is proportionally less developed relative to demand, and the interconnected fragility of modern just-in-time supply chains amplifies shocks in ways that the comparatively simpler economic architecture of the 1970s did not. The political calculation behind a maximum retaliation order is not difficult to understand from a domestic American political perspective. Dead sailors and sunken warships create a public demand for a response that is visibly and unmistakably proportionate to the provocation. Any president who is perceived as hesitating, calibrating, or pulling punches in the face of that kind of attack on American military personnel is making a political calculation with its own severe consequences, both for their administration and for the broader credibility of American deterrence. But the strategic calculation that must run underneath that political logic is required to account for a variable that no public retaliation order can fully acknowledge without itself becoming a strategic liability. The American response that satisfies the domestic political requirement that is large enough, visible enough, and destructive enough to demonstrate that attacking American naval forces carries an intolerable cost may be precisely the response that triggers the Iranian escalation that produces the global economic catastrophe. Managing that tension between what the domestic political situation demands and what the strategic situation can actually absorb without cascading into consequences that dwarf the original military exchange is among the most consequential challenges any American president could face. It is a challenge with no clean resolution and no option set that does not carry significant risk of an outcome worse than the one it was designed to prevent. Unlike the Kennedy administration navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, any modern American president is managing this tension inside a media environment that provides essentially no space for the quiet, deniable, back-channel diplomacy that ultimately resolved that confrontation. Kennedy had days to think, to deliberate, to send private signals and receive private responses before the public posture of either side had hardened beyond the point of flexible management. The back channel that ran through intermediaries while the public confrontation played out on television was not incidental to the resolution of that crisis. It was the mechanism of its resolution. A modern American president managing a military confrontation with Iran would be operating inside a 24-hour news cycle, a social media environment that turns every operational indicator into a public event within minutes of its occurrence, a congressional oversight apparatus with its own political incentives around the conflict, and an allied consultation requirement that involves communicating with dozens of governments simultaneously, each of which has its own domestic political pressures shaping what it can publicly support. The structural conditions that made quiet diplomacy possible in 1962 do not exist in the same form today, and their absence is not a minor procedural inconvenience. It is a fundamental constraint on the range of options available to a president trying to find an exit from an escalation ladder that both sides have an interest in descending, but neither can be seen to descend first. What I find most operationally significant about the strategic behavior Iran has displayed across multiple documented episodes of military confrontation with American forces in the Gulf region, and this is a dimension that Western media coverage has consistently and consequentially underweighted, is the systematic and repeated failure of explicit American military threat to produce deterrence effects on Iranian operational behavior. This pattern is not ambiguous in the historical record. It is not a matter of contested interpretation among analysts who have studied it carefully. It is a documented behavioral signature that appears across enough distinct episodes, across enough different American administrations, employing enough different combinations of threat, sanction, and military demonstration to constitute something approaching a strategic constant. And what it suggests about the assumptions underlying American deterrence theory as applied to Iran should be among the most urgent questions in current strategic analysis.